All right, let's talk constraints. Constraints are a tool to apply a validation against data that will be inserted. And so we've looked at this throughout the course. We've seen many different types of constraints. In the previous video, we even mentioned constraints on the primary key, constraints on not being null. But I really wanted to zoom in here on constraints and look at how constraints work and how they help us. Because at the end of the day, they are a tool to apply validation methods against data that will be inserted. So what we're trying to say here is that when you apply a constraint, what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, hey, when you insert data into my table, follow my rules. Follow my rules and make sure that the data corresponds with what I want to be inserted. Let's say you wanted to put a constraint on the email field and you wanted to apply a bunch of crazy checks to make sure that it is actually a valid email. That's a valid constraint. Or let's say you wanted to constrain the validation of a phone number to adhere to a certain structure. That's a valid constraint. Primary keys are a valid constraint. Again, not null, foreign key. All of these are constraints. All of these are validation methods that are saying, hey, data must be inserted this way. When we think about constraints, there are two very, very important distinctions to make. Column constraints is one of them. Applying a constraint as part of a column definition. And we've seen this happen. We've done this. On the student table, we applied a column constraint that said that certain columns could not be null. Now, when we talk about column constraints, what we're talking about is a constraint that is part of the definition. So part of that same line, when we're defining the column and we're saying column student ID is UUID and then it's a primary key. Well, we're saying at that point in time, well, this is going to be the primary. When we look at column constraints only apply to that column. They don't apply to multiple columns. They can't cross concerns. They're just for that specific column. Here are some different constraints that you can apply on a column and the meaning. So what do they do? So when we look at column constraints, we're trying to look at a constraint that will be applied uniquely to that specific column, not multiple columns, just that one. And so one that we're very, very familiar with and one that we've seen throughout the course, not null. It cannot be null. It has to have a value. It cannot be the value null. So that's pretty easy. We know all about null values. We're null professionals. When we look here, primary key is another one, and we just applied this to the student table. And the column will be the primary key, and that is very important. We're saying, hey, this column is going to be the primary key. Now, when we talked about primary keys, we also talked about primary keys being able to be multiple columns. Well, when you apply a column constraint, you're not going to be able to do that. It is for that column specifically. So one column is the primary key. And then we have the unique constraint. And what the unique constraint says is it can only contain unique values. So you can only have unique values in this column. They can't overlap with any other values. And null is considered unique. You can't just fill in anything. It has to be a unique value. Null is considered to be unique as well. Remember that. No null is the same. Then we get into some interesting territory. Because these we've seen throughout the course. We've seen unique, we've seen not null, we've seen primary key. We know all about them. But what is this one? Well, this one is check. So what is it going to check? What are we going to do with this one? Well, we're applying a special condition to check against. So, hey, here's a custom check. Here's something that Postgres doesn't have out of the box, but here's a special condition that I want you to check for the values in this column. And this could be, for instance, that email validation we spoke about, that phone number validation we spoke about, that you want a specific sequence or that you want specific characters to be present or whatever else. You can fill in unique special conditions to check against. And that is what check is for. And then last but not least, the constraint references. What does references do? What does it mean? Well, we've talked about primary keys and we've talked about unique, but where are foreign keys at? Well, that's what references is for. references to constrain values of a column to only be the values that exist in a column in another table. Well, that sounds oddly like a foreign key. So what we're saying here is when you apply the constraint references, you're pointing to a different table and a specific column in that table. So you're referencing somewhere else and you're saying, hey, anything you fill in here, it has to correspond with a value in that column in that other table. So a foreign key constraint. And so now that we know all of these column constraints, we're basically column constraint masters. But hold up. These are not the only types of constraints that we can apply. And so let's go a bit deeper here. And let's look at table constraints.